This podcast is general in nature and hasn't taken your circumstances into account. It's important you consider your personal circumstances and speak to a financial advisor before deciding what's right for you. Any general tax information provided is provided as a guide only.
So the first episode of the US election sitcom is now over. We've had a bit of a roller coaster this year so far. A change in candidate for the Democratic Party, 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump, and a result that basically was kind of against the polls a little bit again this year. So what's your thought on everything?
Well, pretty amazing, right? I'm kind of depressed because my son, through that period 2017 to 2020, kept joking that if I combed my hair a certain way, I could look like Donald Trump. And that was his constant joke. So here we go again. He's back to that. I must admit, I wasn't that surprised last week because you looked at that little chart for me, which shows Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump and compares that to Biden 4 years ago. And Kamala Harris was sort of line ball with Trump going into this election, whereas Biden was 7 points ahead. Even Hillary Clinton was 5 points ahead going into the 2016 election. And she just lost and Biden just won. And so Kamala Harris was, a long way behind compared to where they were. So in that sense, it didn't surprise me. But I know there's a lot of Australians, I've come across a lot of people who are really depressed by this. Polls in Australia showed that something like 70% of Australians would have voted for Kamala Harris, 30% or less would have voted for Trump. So you can sort of understand why people are a little bit depressed. But I think if you look at it from an economic point of view, it reminds me of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think it's something like that. It starts with basic survival stuff, food, clothing, shelter, and then you get back up to these more luxurious things at the top. And I think that's what's happened here. The cost of living problem in the US and concerns that immigration was making that situation worse just dominated all these other issues. And that's why people turned to Trump, because they felt that over the last 4 years, we're not better off. We've gone backwards. You can do similar numbers in Australia. Prices are up 19, 20% in the US, wages are up, say, 13, 14%, similar numbers in Australia, and therefore people have actually gone backwards. That's, I think, what dominated in the end. So one shouldn't necessarily read into it a rejection of gender equality or that Americans no longer care about the environment. I think it was just pure economics and the so-called, what my father used to call the hip pocket nerve. Not that I even have a hip pocket these days to put my wallet in, but that's what dominated in all of this.
I totally agree. I think the thing that a lot of people learned from this, failed campaign from Kamala Harris is that you can't just campaign on vibes. You basically have to focus on the concrete stuff that people worry about. So one of the things that surprised me about the results was that Donald Trump actually won in all 7 swing states. That's pretty remarkable. Again, even if you look at the polls just within these swing states, then it's a bit more liable. Harris even led in a bunch of them. But Donald Trump came out ahead in all 7 of them. And if you look at the economic data in these 7 swing states, they're actually a little bit behind the other states, say California or New York in the US. The misery indexes, which is a combination of inflation rates and unemployment rates in these states, are a bit worse than elsewhere. They didn't actually benefit from the boom in productivity from the tech sector in the US in the past 2 years. And I think Donald Trump was really smart to actually capture on that, negative sentiment in these swing states. And another thing that kind of surprised me a bit is that Biden actually did have a lot of policies trying to spike up manufacturing industries in these Rust Belt states, especially, say, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And you did see the manufacturing PMIs in the US bounce back quite a bit in the last year. But it seems like it's still not enough for these swing state voters to go out against Trump.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. The misery index was improving under Biden and I guess Harris, and that should have meant that Trump would have lost rather. I got that around the wrong way. But I think the cumulative decline in people's perceived living standards just got the better of all of that. And you're also right, in some of those swing states, things weren't so good. Or maybe not as strong as in New York or California. And of course, New York and California were decisively for the Democrats. I guess what interested me was just the knee-jerk reaction we saw a week ago. Shares went up, bond yields went up, Bitcoin went up.
And Dogecoin went up.
Dogecoin went up. And of course, now we've got the Department of Government Efficiency run by
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk and one of the presidential candidates going into that. So that's going to be interesting to see how that pans out. Of course, the US dollar's also gone up. So in a purely economic sense, you could argue what we saw in that knee-jerk reaction was consistent. Investors are thinking, well, animal spirits are going to be unleashed. That'll lead to stronger economic growth, higher interest rates in the US than otherwise would have been the case. And therefore, you saw higher shares and higher bond yields and a higher US dollar. And of course, Donald Trump is known to like Bitcoin and cryptos compared to the Democrats. So now I think what you're seeing is a more discerning reaction by markets. If you look at European shares, they're actually down slightly. There has hardly been any boost there. Concern about the tariffs. Similar stories starting to emerge in Australia. Yes, Bitcoin and Dogecoin, they're up decisively. We're yet to see what Trump and JD Vance will do on that front. I kind of think Bitcoin to me is kind of interesting in a sense. If you put all skepticism aside and just look at it from a technical point of view, you saw this massive rally into earlier this year around the time of the halving or just before it. Halving in the number of Bitcoin miners.
The supply of Bitcoin goes
supply
down.
of Bitcoin process starts to slow down further. That massive rally to 73,000 US or thereabouts, then it traced out this descending trend with a pattern of lower highs and lower lows. And then even before the election, it started to rise because the market was anticipating that Trump would perhaps win. And now, of course, it's decisively broken higher. So it looks to me from a purely technical point of view that it's going to go higher, even though from a fundamental point of view, you can sort of debate why would that be. But from a technical point of view, it looks like it's going to have more money coming into it.
To be fair, the strength of share markets and Bitcoin did surprise me a bit because, to be fair, this time, Trump is not a surprise win anymore. Betting markets were actually already pricing in the odds of him getting into the White House.
Back in 2016, he was a surprise. He was the outsider.
Yeah. And we still saw this outside surprise in Bitcoin reaching 90K in the past few days. That's the new record high. The S&P 500 reached new record high as well. On election day, it gained 2.5%.
Yeah.
And it's now having the best year-to-date performance of the 21st century, up 25%.
This century, not including last century. 21st century is this century.
Yeah.
I always get confused by that. I remember last century I was watching 20th Century Fox and... it was 20th Century Fox. So that was the right century.
I was a 5-year-old.
Are they still called 20th Century Fox?
Yeah,
I can't remember.
I think they.
So they belong in the last century.
Yeah.
Anyway, totally confusing. That's a phenomenal gain.
Yeah.
Now, strongest
25% year to date.
Year to date, strongest in the last 24 years, 25 years. So that's a phenomenal gain. You could sort of argue, you can understand why the US share market is up. It's messier for global markets because of concerns about the tariffs. And as time's gone by, Donald Trump's announcement regarding his key advisors, he's putting in China hawks as his, the national security advisor and I think Marco Rubio. So it looks like he's going to behave in a way which is consistent with what he's talking about. Tough on China, tariffs, and of course, Department of Government Efficiency, focusing on laying off public servants. But so the US share market sort of says, well, okay, well, that's all positive, Reaganite type policies in some ways. But the rest of the world's thinking, well, if we have these tariffs, that could be bad for us. That's why you're seeing this sort of mixed reaction from many other markets around the world, including our one. And then, of course, we get the Chinese. A week or so ago, everyone was
trying to come out with new stimulus measures, but they didn't really have anything that hand out money to the consumers again. So some people are a bit disappointed about that.
I can understand that. I think there was some money in there. Was it 10 trillion renminbi for Chinese local governments? So that gives them money to spend, basically. It's all very complicated the way they do it, but they're going to have more money to spend, infrastructure spending and so on. But I think, and that 10 trillion is spread over 3 to 5 years. So you actually... turns out to be about 2.8 trillion.
It's quite small. The scale versus their GDP is much lower than what they gave out back in the GFC.
Yeah, I sort of calculate it's about 2%, 2.2, 2.1, 2.2% of GDP. So it's not a massive stimulus. And you're right, I think the market was hoping for more on consumer spending because that's been the key area of weakness, retail sales and so on. That's the area where you've got to ignite in China. If you want the economy to keep going in China, you've got to now focus more on the consumer.
Yeah, that's right. Because, well, they've had a lot of products to export, but now with the threat of tariffs, with new trade wars, they can't export as much anymore. And what we've seen, I think, in Trump 1.0 is that they redirected some of these exports to the third country, say Mexico, India, Vietnam, Malaysia. They have been pretty good beneficiaries of that trade war. I'm just not sure if that's going to happen this time again, just because Trump has less checks and balances this time around. He has the whole Congress behind him. He's not a newbie in Washington, D.C. anymore, and he can't run again. So some people are a bit worried that he might actually go all out on China, and not just China, everyone who has a trade deficit with the US, so including Mexico, India, Vietnam, Malaysia.
There's a theory that the production has just shifted out of China into Vietnam or Mexico,
which is what
and
happens
then come
with
into the US.
Apple. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess the one thing that does give me a little bit of optimism on that front, and I take that point. He can't run again unless he declares himself dictator. The checks and balances aren't going to be there. And the last time around, he had a bunch of old school Republicans as his part of his team. They're no longer there. The people who he's appointing are people who agree with him completely. Minor disagreements, but generally speaking, they're on his side. The one thing that gives me a little bit of pause, so I don't get too negative, is that he wants the share market to go up. He sees the share market as a barometer of his success. And we saw that back in 2018 with the tariff war. So people say, well, we had a tariff war back then, but it wasn't so bad. Mind you, the tariffs he put on back then were a fraction of what he's talking about this time around. But the thing that stopped him was the plunge in the share market. It fell 20% from its high earlier in the year to its low on Christmas Eve 2018, partly in response to the tariffs. Donald Trump got nervous and then pivoted to the phase one trade deal with China. And 2019 was a good year, of course, helped by the Fed cutting interest rates. So I kind of think that he'd probably want to get to the end of his 4-year term and want to see shares higher rather than lower. So that gives me a little bit of confidence that there is some check on him, that he's not going to get too aggressive and too carried away.
Yeah, I totally agree with that as well. And that's, that checks and balances extend to the bond markets as well. There's been a lot of talk about the rising US deficit as well as the rising US debt to GDP burden. But I do think that, that rising bond yields reflecting the rising odds of Trump's getting into the office, doing something crazy again, might act as a check on him as well. Because the bond markets might revolt against him, like what we saw in the UK with Liz Truss.
That's right. That is another check. That is another check on Trump.
And also, I think everyone should remember that the US political cycle is actually relatively short. We have midterm elections in 2 years again. And actually, it is very likely that there is a swap in the majority party, either in the Senate or the House again. Yeah. So the Republicans might actually still act as checks and balances on him as well, because they do want to run again.
That's quite true. I guess the other thing is, if you look, I know a lot of people get all negative on this. This is all going to be terrible for the world. But if you go back to that period, there was a lot of fear in 2016 as to what Trump would mean. It turned out, and there's lots of swings and roundabouts, this with the checks and balances and so on. But it turned out, we had 3 good years for shares, 1 bad year, which was 2018. So it wasn't all disastrous in the great scheme of things. I think the other thing we need to notice as investors is that other things happen. Through that period, 2017 to 2020, we didn't spend all our time just looking at Donald Trump. There's lots of other things going on, apart from the pandemic, of course, which will impact share markets. And we're still in an environment globally where inflation is trending down. It's messy. It's not going in a straight line. There's a few ups and downs, but the broad trend is down. And that ultimately should mean an ongoing progress towards lower interest rates globally. And we saw just now, you put out a note on wages growth, which surprised everybody in Australia on the soft side.
Yeah, wages growth in Australia is now 3.5%, while that is still higher than inflation. That means everyone's actually getting a real wage rise rather than a wage rise that's eroded by inflation. But that's
Because
actually
inflation's 2.8. So.
yes, correct. So you're basically getting some actual, purchasing power here with your wage rise. But that has softened quite a bit from where we were a year ago. And many other labor market indicators have weakened in Australia, as well as US and many other developed markets. So now that, inflation pressures have normalized, basically in most developed market countries, it's still lingering a little bit here in Australia. Central banks would probably focus a bit more on these deteriorating labor markets around the world. And I think fundamentally for markets, rate cuts are generally good provided that we don't have a recession. And so far, I do think that narrative still stands. We might actually do have a soft landing if central banks are a bit more concerned about these. Lower job vacancies, lower job openings to unemployment ratios, lower wages growth that might, dampen growth in income for households. They might actually keep cutting rates throughout next year.
Yeah.
And that might actually provide boosts to markets further.
Yeah. I guess everyone's interested in Australia. Well, people listening to this who are in Australia are interested in Australia, and the Reserve Bank there in the last week or so seemed somewhat neutral, which I thought was good because prior to that they were sort of seemed to be more of a tightening bias. Now it seems a bit more neutral, which I thought was good. Yes, the inflation numbers are still too high, but they have been going in the right direction. And then we've got those wages numbers, which 3.5%, as you say. If we look at the UK, I think the latest wages growth was around 4.8. In the US, it's around 4. So we're actually lower than in several other countries around the world. I think also compared to Canada, we're somewhat lower. So that's a good sign. If you want to get super optimistic, you'd say from an inflation point of view, not necessarily for workers, you could say, well, wages growth in the last 3 quarters has averaged just 0.8%. Annualise that, you got 3.2, which is not excessively high relative to what the Reserve Bank requires to be consistent with 2 to 3% inflation. So all up, I'm still reasonably confident that we are going to see rate cuts probably by February next year, even though the money markets lately seem to have pushed it out all the way to the middle of the year, potentially August.
I want to take it back a little bit here for our listeners. So basically why we care so much about wages is, lower wages growth, is it actually a good thing for workers? For now, we do think that it's actually a positive number in the sense that wages feed into services inflation, and that's the stickiest part of inflation that the Reserve Bank is worried about. So if you look at the prices that are fastest rising at the moment, those are healthcare, tobacco prices, which are indexed to some, wages numbers as well, insurance, those kind of services have been a bit more sticky lately. And now that we have, cooling wages pressures in particular in these industries as well, in healthcare, education, and administration services, then you'll start to see inflation pressures cool even further, and that would give the RBA room to actually cut rates earlier than later next year.
Yeah, that's why we economists think somewhat slower wages growth is probably a good thing. We don't want to see workers go backwards, which they have over the last 3 or 4 years. We are still behind. Prices have still gone up more than people's wages. But we do want to see lower interest rates. So in that sense, you want to see somewhat lower wages.
You want to see positive wage growth, but lower than something that's not sustainable.
The ideal generally is thought to be around 3.5% wages growth, somewhere between 3 and 4. And that might be consistent with, say, 2 to 3% inflation growth. But I take the point. People have gone backwards over the last few years, and the Reserve Bank would say, well, that's partly because productivity growth has been so poor. And one of the factors behind that, when you look at the productivity numbers, productivity is basically output per worker. So it's how much you're making for the hours you put in, and it hasn't moved anywhere since 2016. And if you look through history, it's productivity which drives growth in people's living standards. And one of the concerns I have is that we've seen a rise in the public sector relative to the private sector. Productivity in the private sector tends to be quite high, whereas in the public sector it tends to be relatively low. So I do kind of worry that if we continue to grow our public sector, areas like defence, the care economy. I'm not saying we don't need carers out there. We certainly do. But I do worry that it is going to mean slower growth in our living standards over long periods of time.
Maybe Australia needs a Department of Government Efficiency here.
Well, I was thinking about that. Tony Abbott would say, well, we had one of them. We had a government budget audit.
We have the Productivity Commissioners.
Yeah, we have a Productivity Commission, but they're focused on the broader economy. We did have an audit of government spending, I think it was back in 2014. This was when the then coalition government under Tony Abbott was elected, and he was very concerned about budget deficits. This was when you got paranoia about budget deficits. And of course, that led to the disastrous almost budget of 2014, where it created big problems for the government and ultimately led to their decline in popularity. So to some degree, and Tony Abbott was eventually replaced, I think it was at 2015-16 by Malcolm Turnbull. But it was an interesting period. We did have something very similar to the Department of Government Efficiency, the so-called DOGE department that the US has had. So it's interesting to see them going down a similar path all these years later to what we went down. But you're right. I do have these concerns that yes, if we want to spend more on NDIS, aged care, and so on, and they're worthy things to spend money on, we've got to find other areas to contain government spending. Otherwise, we will end up with lower growth in productivity, and it will mean lower growth in our living standards on a long-term basis. So it's a definite balancing act.
That actually brings me to another point. I think, a lot of people, not just in the US, not just in Australia, actually throughout the world, are very unhappy with the living standards. So basically, for example, in Australia, GDP per capita has gone backwards. Consumption per capita has gone backwards for a while now. And that seems to be the catalyst for change in government. So you've seen that in the US, you probably will see that in Canada, and you might actually see that in Australia.
In the UK.
And the UK.
Yeah.
So you might actually see that in Australia next year as well.
Actually, it's an issue right through Europe with France.
Yeah, true.
The coalition in Germany looks like it's collapsing. So it seems to be a general issue, and certainly if you think America's got issues, then we have exactly the same in Australia because the numbers are the same. People's real wages have gone down by 6% or so. So it's an interesting thing to keep an eye on. It's difficult for governments to manage their way out of that because if they think, well, we'll just spend some more money, the problem is that can actually lead to more inflation.
Yeah, that's true. And that's what people are worried about Trump presidency. More tax cuts means less revenue for the government, but he still has a lot of spending plans.
That's the other funny, you just reminded me of something there, that Biden and in Australia, the Australian government under Albanese has prioritised jobs. But in the US, it seems they were penalised for that because you got very low unemployment, but they were given no credit for that. In the end, they were just blamed for the high rise in the cost of living and the decline in the value of their real wages. So it is a bit of a lesson that at the end of the day, only a small portion of the population gets unemployed, but everyone gets affected by inflation. So the Reserve Bank is right. We've got to get inflation down because it impacts everybody.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's it. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Shane.
For more info on Shane and Diana's podcasts and reports, head to the Insights Hub at amp.com.au.